Hello, it's a privilege to be with you today. I'd like to thank Dr. Dochuk for his thoughtful and well-researched paper. As a professor of Chicano studies at UCLA and a historian, I learned a lot. I'm not typically familiar with the literature on southern migrations to California, as well as the missiological literature on evangelization in Southern California. So it was a great privilege for me. In these few minutes, I'm going to share a Latino perspective from below about the same phenomena that Dr. Dochuk has shared about. I'd like to begin with a quote, part of a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in which he says, "There remains an experience of incomparable value. We have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below." And so in our time together, I wish to share a historical analysis from a Latino perspective from below. What you see here in the screen is a map of racial segregation in Southern California and in Los Angeles in particular in the late 1940s, so overlapping with some of the time period that Dr. Dochuk was describing. In the red zones, these are areas in which Latinos, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, and others were racially segregated into these communities through racially restrictive covenants. And the green areas were areas which people lived who were legally defined as white. And the yellow areas were considered one step above the red, and the blue one step below the green. And this is the map of Southern evangelization efforts. So this is the historical context for those efforts. If you look at real estate documents of the time and realtor reports of these areas, you get very quickly a sense of the racial climate. This is a description put together by a realtor in Boyle Heights, where my family is from. And as you'll see, it describes the nationalities in Boyle Heights at this time. It says Russian, Polish, and Armenian Jews, Negro or African American, Slavs, Greeks, American Mexicans, Japanese, and Italians. And then it uses this very disturbing language. It says subversive racial elements increasing. Subversive racial elements increasing. Later on in this document, it says that this is a melting pot area and is literally honeycombed with diverse and subversive racial elements. We can contrast this with a realtor description of Arcadia, California, not too far from Fuller Seminary. And in this description, what's striking is that it states, deed restrictions provide for single-family structures with a minimum of 2,000 square feet to be constructed under architectural supervision, so fancy houses. But then it says this, racial protection is in perpetuity. So the realtors expected Arcadia and these other green areas to be forever segregated racially. So with that introduction, that geographic sort of introduction, I'd like to provide even more historical context for the Southernization of Southern California and Anglo Protestant missionary efforts during the Jim Crow period. I'd like to first begin by discussing the Great Mexican Migration. So of course, Southern California was Mexico not too long before the larger Southern movement. But between 1900 and 1930, you had a newer migration of 750,000 Mexicans to the United States, many of these immigrants coming to California and Southern California. This led to the Spanish-speaking population in California quadrupling, actually, during this era. Mexican immigrants were recruited after racist legislation was passed, barring all Asian immigrants, Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, and other Eastern and European Jewish groups. And so after these racial laws were passed, the U.S. was in need of labor, and they turned to Mexico, which at the time was undergoing a revolution. And so it was a perfect historical match there. In California, during this time period, 3/4 of all agricultural work were done by these Mexican migrants. 2/3 of workers in construction, food processing, textiles, automobile and steel production, and utilities. And so Mexican immigrants really built all these cities. Pasadena, where Fuller is at, all the cities of the foothills in Southern California were at this time really were built by Mexican immigrants. Right? Mexican communities were the Goshen of its day. But unfortunately, Mexican immigrants were not viewed as culturally equal to Anglo inhabitants. And so you had residential segregation and a proliferation of many segregated communities or barrios or colonias. Again, in places like Fullerton, Placentia, Santa Ana, Pasadena, San Gabriel, et cetera, et cetera. Housing segregation was replicated in churches, in schools, in public spaces like pools and parks. Even the hiking trails of Pasadena were segregated, unfortunately, and there were only certain days that Mexicans could hike, mortuaries, et cetera. So you had this full Jim Crow segregation involving Latino immigrants and Mexican immigrants in particular. Coupled with this holistic segregation, you had Americanization programs. Mexican immigrants were viewed as culturally deficient. And unfortunately, that view of Mexicans as being culturally deficient was also embraced by the church. And church Protestant evangelization efforts were coupled with these Americanization programs. And these Americanization programs, they sought to assimilate Mexican Americans into Anglo-American culture. And teachers, social workers, and religious missionaries created programs to Americanize Mexican immigrants. And these efforts were focused especially upon women and children. And these classes took place, many of them in churches, community centers, and neighborhood homes. So in the same way that Europeans went overseas and coupled colonization with religious instruction and religious evangelization efforts, the same thing happened to Mexicans in what was once their own territory. Though Mexican immigrants served as really indispensable labor for the construction, for the development of Southern California, once the Great Depression hit, Mexican immigrants were scapegoated. And so in the 1930s, you had over 300,000 Mexicans who were repatriated or deported back to Mexico. And this constituted 2/3 of all Mexicans who came to the United States in the 1920s, sent back to Mexico. And unfortunately, as a historian, I can tell you that 80% of the repatriates were actually US citizens or legal residents of the United States. World War II comes along, and there's another labor shortage, and Mexican immigrants are recruited once again. Unfortunately, Mexican immigrants get scapegoated again in the 1950s through something that's known as Operation Wetback. And more than 1 million Mexican immigrants were expelled from the US from spring to September 1954. And so unfortunately, this was the context of the Southern migration. Southern migrants actually reinforced, they brought these racial attitudes from the South. And so their evangelization efforts, again, were coupled with profound racial discrimination and a view of the Mexican immigrant community as culturally deficient. But in response to all of this, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and other Latinos fought back. We fought back against this ethnic and racial discrimination in society as well as in the institutional life of the Protestant church. And Latino Protestants took bold stands. We founded our own ecclesial communities and councils. We created culturally contextualized ministries and theologies that allowed us to care for those on the margins. Insofar as they challenged the racism, paternalism, and assimilationist structures of mainstream mainstream Protestant denominations, Latinos anticipated and set the stage for the formal development of Protestant Latina theology in the 1960s through the 1980s, and the diverse Latino ecclesial movements which persist and are flowering to the present day. A comprehensive discussion of all this can be found in Dr. Juan Martinez's important book from 2 years ago called The Story of Latino Protestants in the United States. These efforts, these social justice efforts of the Latino community are also part of a larger 500-year history, which I talk about in my own recent book called The Brown Church. What a lot of people don't realize is that actually the Latino social justice Christian tradition began in 1511, even before the Protestant Catholic divide. So these Latino Protestants created many different types of denominations and institutions, and here is just a very brief overview. They created the Latin American Council of Christian Churches, the Instituto Bíblico Mitzpah, the Latin American Bible Institute, which continues to the present day in La Puente. These Latino Protestants were from various denominations: Assemblies of God, Seventh-day Adventist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Nazarene. Some notable leaders at this time include Francisco el Azteca Olazabal, Romana Carvajal de Valenzuela, José Celestino Rodríguez, Santos Elizondo, Leoncia Rosado, Francisco Rosado, and the late Jesse Miranda, who just recently passed away. Men and women Protestant leaders led by the Spirit of God to form their own institutions and churches and structures which gave dignity to the Latino community. We even engaged in our own cultural production. And for example, Dr. Daniel Ramirez has written a book called Migrating Faith that talks about the Latino Pentecostal hymnology which arose during this time period. Again, this is just a brief sampling. It's worth noting that many Latinos inspired by Catholic social teachings, again, not Protestant because of the reinforcement, sadly, of Protestantism and racial segregation, but inspired by Catholic social teachings, many Latinos challenged segregation in housing, education, and public spaces, specifically in California, but also throughout the United States. So you had the challenging of segregated Mexican schools and segregated housing, specifically by Latino leaders who drew from their Catholic faith and Catholic social teachings. Finally, what is the connection between this history and the present moment? By way of summary, Anglo-Protestant migration to Southern California during the Jim Crow era produced evangelistic models based upon a cultural deficit approach to the Mexican, Puerto Rican, and larger Latino community. The churches, Bible institutes, seminaries, and denominational structures established by these Southern migrants reinforced de jure and de facto segregation and perpetuated racist attitudes towards the Latino community. In response, Latino Protestants created their own churches, Bible institutes, contextualized ministries and theologies, which allowed us to care for those cast to the margins of Anglo society. And tragically, such cultural deficiency models of missiology continue to the present day in various forms. One result that I see all the time as a professor, as a pastor, as a community organizer, is that millions of young Latinas and Latinos are currently fleeing the evangelical church. And I see it all the time as I speak throughout the country. On a hopeful note, however, as it did 1 century ago, the Brown Church is rising up to create its own institutions and ecclesial networks, which dignify the diverse and growing Latino community and empower its voice. Thank you.